Morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out so early in the morning on a beautiful Washington morning after a rainy and stormy night. I'm really pleased to be here and to be part of a conversation about foreign policy under the next administration. There's an awful lot to talk about. Before I kick things off, I did want to say just a word or two about Brookings. Hopefully you've heard of us before. We have been a think tank in Washington for about 108 years. And we have work that spans from the local to the global, from various disciplines, economics to domestic politics to foreign policy. And we are a nonpartisan organization, very much focused on fact-based research. And one of the key things that we do in terms of doing really serious, rigorous research is try to write books. And so let me just share with you that my colleague Melanie Sisson has a book coming out on Saturday, which is called The United States, China, and the Competition for Control. So I hope you will go to Amazon and look it up. And she will be out there looking to speak to audiences all around the country to talk a little bit more about these really big issues that are confronting us today. So just to kick things off, I think we wanted to start with a little bit of a dialogue about what the election of President Trump to a second term may mean for the United States' role in the world and how allies, partners, and adversaries are reacting. Melanie, do you want to start off that conversation?
Sure. Well, thank you, Suzanne, for mentioning the book. I really appreciate it. And thanks for having me here today. It's really wonderful. Thank you all for joining us, as Suzanne said, on this post-rain early morning. I hope you got the thematic breakfast. We're told that there were B items, and this is the breakfast briefing with Brookings. So hope you all have enjoyed that. And really, thanks for your engagement and interest in these issues and what the United States is doing in the world and why and what is happening to and for the United States in reverse. This is a really important time to be looking broadly and thinking deeply about what it is that we're facing in the coming years. I actually will take just a quick minute. The book that Suzanne mentioned that I have coming out actually resonates, I think, with the thematic sort of structure of what it is that you're doing here right now, saying things from the other side. And what I mean by that is the reason that I embarked upon the book in the first place is because I was surprised at how quickly a very pervasive narrative about the US-China relationship had arisen and become really deeply entrenched and was really informing policy in important and consequential sorts of ways. This narrative, I'm sure you're well familiar, has to do with the United States as a country that was really important to the formation of what has come to be called a liberal international rules-based order. And the perception by many that China was working to attack that order and to try to change it and to make it into some other version that's more compatible with its authoritarian domestic political preferences. And I found myself having a lot of questions about that narrative, in part because it had become sort of so, so common, just heard it all the time. And so being at a place like Brookings and working with someone like Suzanne sort of gave me the latitude to go learn some things. And when I went out to learn sort of what is this order that we're talking about, where did it come from, what does it mean in practice, how have states behaved in relation to it, what I had to do actually was see things from the other side, not just look very closely at the empirical record about what the United States and China have done, which is important and fact-based and all of, should be really sort of at the core of how we make our policy decisions, but it also required me to learn things about our philosophical traditions here in the United States and also to consider the philosophical traditions in China and to gain what I might call some strategic empathy for China, to try to understand that perspective. And what I learned from the exercise, aside from getting a much better landscape, I think, a much more clear fact-based understanding of what's been happening in the world, what the United States has been doing, what China has been doing, and why. What I learned primarily is that this narrative, instead of calling policymaker attention to and galvanizing reactions appropriately to the level of risk and threat that China poses was actually creating, I thought, more risk in the relationship. And it was doing that by overloading what are sort of expected kinds of conflicts of interest with this sort of much more expansive meaning. And so policymakers' reactions to those were similarly overloaded. So it was obscuring sort of ways in which those true threats and risks could be handled in ways that would make the threat of violent conflict less likely. But it was also hiding from us, and I think continues to be, hiding ways and opportunities for us to work together meaningfully to make the international environment more stable, more secure, to help us work through these specific conflicts of interest in a way that is much more constructive and productive than it is destructive, and the converse. So, I think that the exercise was a useful education for me, and hopefully that the work I can do from it will maybe get infused a little bit into the narrative and inform policy in ways that, again, sort of forward, defend, and promote U.S. interests without unnecessarily heightening the kinds of risks and dangers that we don't want to see in the world. So looking ahead a little bit, of course, I'll be watching what the Trump administration's approach to China will be in the coming years. I will confess to you that I never like to make predictions because I don't like to be wrong, and when I make predictions it sets me up sometimes to be wrong. But I do think there are ways we can anticipate things that are more or less likely. We can match some patterns from past experience and sort of forecast a little bit into the future. That said, this administration makes that really difficult. There are a number of appointments that Trump has made, individuals who are known to be very hawkish on China and to have energies that continue to move the U.S.-China relationship in confrontational sorts of directions. He also has other influences in his circle, business interests and others who might have reasons to push the direction of policy in the other direction. So it's not clear how that tussle will quite shape up. And truthfully, I can make a very logical and reasoned argument in either direction. And I think that's broadly true for all of my expectations for U.S. foreign policy. If you tell me which direction you'd like me to argue, I can probably find a way to do it that's compatible with what I see in the administration. There are a few things that are clear. That Trump, in his approach with all countries, including and perhaps especially with U.S. partners and allies, is likely to be more extractive in those relationships than has been true for the United States in the past. And that sort of extractive nature might come in the form of what politely is called burden sharing, but sort of more colloquially is called getting the other side to pay up more. That might be true with even our longtime allies, where we have substantial overseas bases, fighting over sort of the distribution of cost and expense of those. It might be more extractive in terms of looking to give the U.S. military a little bit more liberty to operate in those regions without the limitations and constraints that are in place in some of the alliance and partnership agreements that we have. It might be more extractive in the sense of Trump himself getting more attention from leaders and sort of feeling himself that he is being regarded as a strong and important leader. So there's any number of ways that the sort of tenor and tone of those relationships might change, and they might even change in the actual application and practice as well. I think it's also the case that when we look back at Trump's decision-making when it comes to the use of force, he does like to talk tough, and he seems to me to be very drawn to the military and the use of force in the abstract. When it gets down to making those very serious and hard decisions about whether or not to actually use force, he seems to have less of an appetite for it. But in ways that again, are very difficult to predict. So it's not at all clear to me what we should sort of expect. I'll just say one last word and then hand over to Suzanne. You know, it turns out that foreign policy is hard. The problems that the world is a very big place. I don't have to tell you that. There are things happening everywhere and all the time, many of which are not directly controlled or controllable, and it's relentless. Other states don't always do things just to you know, make life difficult for the United States. They have their own enlightened self-interests that they pursue. That is not going to change. And when that happens, it creates potential crises, it creates potential conflicts, and none of those has available easy solutions. If there were easy solutions, these would be problems that are solved. So Trump has ambitions to call to a close some very intractable problems right now. I think we have to expect it's going to be harder than he thinks that it might be. So I'll stop there and hand over to you, Suzanne. Thanks.
Well, as always, Melanie put a lot of really interesting substance on the table. I'm going to try to pick up on a couple of the themes that she mentioned, and then maybe pose some more questions for her to continue the conversation. But we also do want to preview that we really do want to hear from all of you, and so we will relatively early in our conversation go out to the audience and look for your questions, whether it's on specific topics or specific appointments or specific developments in the world. Really looking forward to hearing from all of you. I think one of the main topics I hope we can do a little bit more of a deep dive around is just the U.S.-China relationship and where we might think that's going under the Trump administration. I think, you know, it's obviously the most consequential relationship in the world, and it is certainly the most consequential relationship here in Washington. It is a near-peer competitor. China is the one country in the international system that actually has the capacity, and at least some believe the intent, to try to change the system to its own advantage and to the disadvantage of the United States and some of its longstanding partners and allies. And so to segue into another topic I want to speak to is just this question of bipartisanship in foreign policy, which is something we've been thinking a little bit about at Brookings, because there is at least a sense that there is a tradition of politics stopping at the water's edge, and that may have changed in recent years. I think historians would probably have a more nuanced view of how much change there is and how much continuity there is. But it is true that there have been issues on which we have really powerful differences across the aisle that weren't always the case. It's also true that, as you pointed out on the issue of the China relationship, that there can be a bit of a problematic dynamic when there's too much bipartisanship, when there's a narrative that tends to dominate. And because my primary work outside of the bureaucratic stuff is on the Middle East, I can tell you that that was the experience in the aftermath of 9/11 here in Washington. And I actually left Washington, and I was telling someone, moved to Houston for a couple of years. And it was remarkable for me to come back and bring colleagues. I worked in the private sector, so I brought colleagues from the oil sector up to Washington to talk to people in the run-up to the war in Iraq. And what was fascinating to me was that the folks in the private sector actually had a really good nuanced understanding. We actually gamed out what might happen in the aftermath of the US invasion of Iraq, and I think we got it better than the analysts that I would hear in think tanks and in government, different departments of the Bush administration, on how things might play out. Because in effect, so many people have such nuanced understanding, and sometimes government isn't listening to those folks. So I think it's one of the really important dimensions of your visit here, and the fact that you engage with people in Washington, because it's not just learning from what Washington might be thinking or doing, or what people in government might be thinking or doing, but it's also bringing a really important perspective from a different set of intersections with different issues. And so I do think this question of, you know, is there a dominant narrative on China which we have signed on to? It was in fact we've been talking about the pivot to Asia for multiple administrations. It was the Trump administration, part one, that developed a national security strategy which really identified China as the major challenge and really elevated this idea of strategic competition. It's something that the Biden administration has kept relatively stable in terms of its own articulation of our most compelling interests and how we're going to structure ourselves to advance those. And is it time for us to kind of red team that? Should we be thinking outside the box? And how do we actually go about that? I want to bring up and come back to this question of our partnerships and alliances, because that has been the buzzword for the Biden administration. They've done a lot of investing in trying to, ensure that those relationships are as fruitful as possible, that we're not sort of just sticking to the old arrangements where we do have a lot invested, and one of those would be NATO, but in fact that there are these efforts to create what our colleagues at Brookings call mini-laterals, partnerships and small groups around issue-based concerns. And so whether it's the Quad, whether it's AUKUS, there have been a variety of arrangements that the Biden administration has really spent a lot of time and effort around. And I think one of the questions for me is, do those hold under a Trump administration that may not, care about the specifics, but may actually have similar interests and similar objectives in terms of the relationships with those countries? Just to kind of end things and maybe flip it back to Melanie to say a few words and hopefully get you all thinking about all these topics. I think, one of the points that you made was just how unpredictable the world is and how difficult it is to extrapolate from the individuals that we've yet had named in terms of the national security bureaucracy. We can point to some, sort of broad generalizations, right? That the National Security Advisor designate and the nomination for the Secretary of State are probably more traditional Republican, almost conventional appointments, a senator, a member of the House of Representatives, both with long experience in the foreign policy space. They may be expected to be relatively predictable, but we may also not appreciate how they're going to behave in an administration that also includes, people from Worldwide Wrestling and Fox News and lots of different backgrounds that are not the traditional way that folks in Washington see their careers ascending. And so what the interaction might look like between the different national security agencies, how those personalities might staff below, because as we know, the Pentagon is an enormous organization, the State Department, even the National Security Council is quite a lot of people, and how exactly Representative Waltz goes about that staffing, how he structures, to what extent, as in the current administration, it is not just a coordination agency, coordinating between the various government departments, but really the implementer, which has been true for the Biden National Security Council, or whether in fact, as we've seen in the past under both Democratic and Republican administrations, cabinet officials have much more leeway and bandwidth in terms of shaping the agenda for either defense or diplomacy or the other big issues. I will say, we talk about the national security agencies, but let's be clear, commerce is playing at least as big a role, and I'm sure that will be the case under the next Trump administration, and Treasury and a number of other agencies that we don't traditionally think of as national security agencies. But how much can we extrapolate? How much can we predict? And how much is going to be shaped by events that we don't necessarily see coming around the corner?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just pick up quickly on two of the points that Suzanne just raised, and then let's see if there are things that you're all interested in or would like us to hear from your perspective. Questions and comments are both really welcomed and appreciated. The personnel matter is really significant, not just from the perspective of the direction the leaders want to go, but the government apparatus and whatever one's views of, is there a deep state? Is there not a deep state? What does it mean? What does it not mean? Any of those things. I think it's very fair to say that that the people who work in these government agencies generally want to do their jobs properly, and the way they understand how to do their jobs properly is the processes, policies, and procedures that leaders of their respective agencies and organizations implement. They create the incentives for people to do their jobs well. And so, as this new leadership team comes in and wants to make change, it can't all just be at this top level and have the expectation that an agency like the Department of Defense will be able to turn and accomplish that. It's just 26,000 people with office spaces in one building, not to mention the entire national footprint. It's a huge human organizational challenge, and they're going to have to be attentive to that if they have policy goals and they want to achieve them. Once they sort out sort of amongst that leadership level what direction they actually do want to take policy. So there's a lot that's unknown there, and it's especially important because it is absolutely the case that China does pose some threats and risks to U.S. interests. The purpose of U.S. foreign policy is to allow Americans to live, to borrow Roosevelt's phrase, in freedom from want and freedom from fear. Right? And so what that means is, what can we do in the international environment to allow the American people to focus on cultivating their talents, using their energies to be creative and productive and innovative in the national economy, and do all of that while being at a minimum of risk of either being attacked directly or being involved in an overseas war. And doing that will require this administration and many of them afterwards to have a lot of discipline and clarity of thought in terms of how we approach what it is that China is doing, especially in East Asia, and where that starts to encroach in other parts of the world as well. There are real challenges there. And so my hope is that we will focus on those for what they are, and we will understand some of the limitations that we have in responding to them, and generate strategies that allow us to take on those challenges, to retain U.S. values and principles, to defend and promote our interests and those of our allies and partners in ways that minimize the risk of overt conflict. Because that's really the catastrophe. If we want to talk about the purpose of international order, it's because we had two terrible world wars. I mean, and everybody rightly decided afterwards, well, hey, we shouldn't do that again. And we especially shouldn't do that again now that we have nuclear weapons. Like lots and lots and lots of nuclear weapons, and there are more coming. So this is, it's just, we don't want to sort of dance on that razor's edge. And the purpose of our policymaking apparatus and places like the Brookings Institution and other think tanks in town and interested citizens who engage on these issues is to work together to press policy in that direction that allows us to live in freedom from want and freedom from fear, right, importantly. So balancing that is never easy, never easy at all. So why don't we see what else you're interested in?
I think there's a mic at the back, so I see a hand right over here.
Thanks very much. Maybe we can meld China and the Middle East, and so both of you can comment on this. When the Chinese announced a year and a half ago or so that they had brought the Gulf and they were bringing the Gulf and Iran back together, kind of mending the differences, and this was a new initiative, I didn't mind much as long as the Chinese did what they should have done, which they didn't, which is, you want to lead diplomacy in that region. You have a problem, which are the Houthis disrupting all commercial traffic. Perfect. You, the Chinese, use your leverage with Iran to have them stop that. The Gulf will like it. It will help Gulf relations between the Gulf states and Iran, the Gulf Arab states and Iran. And that didn't happen. So I don't know what do you think of the prospects of it happening in the future? Is China capable of that? China, I think, is only interested in making sure their ships don't get attacked rather than everybody else's. But if you want to be a diplomatic leader in the world, China, then step up to the plate and use your clout to solve a problem that the whole world would appreciate solved? Thank you.
I think it's a really good question, and I will answer it from the Middle East side, and then maybe Melanie wants to say a word about the Chinese perspective. But knowing a little bit about the history, as I know you do as well, between Iran and Saudi Arabia, I know with confidence that, in fact, it wasn't China that actually brokered that rapprochement. It was really a decision, my sense is, on the part of the Saudis to give the Chinese the opportunity to grandstand, which had value not just in terms of the Saudi relationship with China, but also in terms of the Saudi relationship with the U.S. and what the MBS in particular, the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia, was looking for from the Biden administration, both respect and I think also some specific deliverables in the form of a defense treaty and a civil nuclear program. And I think it caught a lot of attention here in Washington, even though everybody understood that, the real brokering of the rapprochement had been done by the traditional parties, by Oman, by Iraq, but still the fact that China was getting this opportunity drew attention. And I think, even though people understood it wasn't necessarily real, there was a sense that, they're coming for us here, and we've got to play, if we want to be a world leader, we actually have to be able to do that. I think the rapprochement itself is very interesting because it says something not just about what the Gulf states may want from Washington, but what they also expect. And I think it was an indication, and the fact that the rapprochement is held through this horrific environment in the post-October 7th Middle East, is indicative of the Saudi experience under the first Trump administration, when Iran and/or its proxies used drones to attack key critical Saudi oil infrastructure, responsible for about 40% of Saudi oil exports, which is a huge proportion of world oil exports. And took it offline for 6 weeks only because the Saudis have such a professional operation. They were able to get it back online that quickly, and the U.S. did nothing. That, frankly, was shocking, and I think it is one of the examples of how different Trump is. It's not Republican or Democrat, because I think a Bush administration would have immediately responded, a Biden administration, a Clinton administration. Traditional expectations are the U.S. has the back of its Gulf partners. These are not, inked treaties, but the relationships are there. And so I think what the Saudis have done is invest actually in the relationship with Iran, because they feel the need to co-opt Iran rather than have a confrontational relationship. And I think that's actually consistent with the Emiratis, the Qataris, and others in the Gulf. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out under the coming Trump administration, to what extent. And they will have a good relationship, but I think there is a little bit of trust that has been lost, and it is probably a realistic appreciation of what the American electorate feels about getting overly entangled in the Middle East.
And I'll just say just quickly about China. I think China is very intentionally trying to present its role in the world as not less important, but fundamentally different than the United States, and that it does and will continue to approach these sorts of engagements very differently. And so while it would not turn down an opportunity, and often seeks out opportunities to grandstand and to sort of elevate its sense of its visibility and perceptions of potential importance in the world, I think it's generally going to be very cautious to do it in ways that present it as a convener, not as being much more directive or trying to control the behaviors and activities of other countries. So we'll see if that ends up being successful for them or not, but I think that's what I see, yeah.
Do we want to try to take two at a time so we can get a couple and pool them? So maybe two up here. I'm sorry. We can go to that side after.
Yeah, or there, yeah, too.
Quick question for you. These nuanced conversations are so interesting, but in this next administration, is nonpartisan, like Brookings Institute, is that actually considered nonpartisan with all the subtle analyses, or is that considered, yep, you're just missing the boat, or you're leftist or something?
Thank you for being here. My question is, what impact has North Korea's growing relationship with Russia have on its relationship with China?
I'm going to take the easy one, which is the question about Brookings and nonpartisanship, because it's something we think an awful lot about. And we have a phenomenal new president, Dr. Cecilia Rouse, who was serving as the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. So she's an economist, back to Brookings' roots. But she came about a year ago, and she's thinking really carefully about how we bring Brookings into the next great phase of its existence. And we're thinking a lot about impact. And one of the things that we have actually documented is that during the first Trump administration, our impact and engagement was a little bit different than it was with prior administrations, but it wasn't actually less. There was a lot of appetite for ideas, in part because there was some fixed territory on, one of my colleagues has said on China. Trump felt very strongly about tariffs. He felt had almost no feelings on any other part of the U.S.-China relationship, and so there were people at very high levels looking for ideas. We started at that time a dialogue, track 1.5 dialogue, including government officials on both sides with the Chinese on military use of AI. And that dialogue we have briefed to both administrations, Departments of State, Defense, National Security Council, every session we've done now for 6 years or so. And it helped to inform the announcement last week that by President Biden and President Xi that we would both maintain human control of nuclear weapons. And so that was something that started at Brookings during the Trump administration that the Trump team was really invested in, and the Biden team has been as well. So I won't say it's a traditional administration in the sense that, we have sent people into every administration, including the first Trump administration, in state defense or the NSC since FDR from Brookings. I'm not sure if that record will hold. We'll wait and see when they start getting below the cabinet level. We know it will be a little bit more unorthodox, but I think there is just the power of good ideas and the power of people who have the time and the space to think and do the research and look for the facts as opposed to just spout opinions. Actually, it's something people in government have almost no time to do, and so I think the resource is considered valuable. The China, Russia, North Korea one is a super interesting one, and we have colleagues who've worked on that, but I'm going to let Melanie try to speak to it.
Yeah, we certainly have colleagues who work on it much more closely than I do, but what I'll say from what I've been monitoring is, of course, it's a really troubling development, no question. The good news, in a sense, is that it's also a troubling development for China. This is not something that they will want to see evolve into a much more firm and fixed relationship between Russia and North Korea. China has its own interests, not just sort of regionally, but specific to North Korea, and it certainly is not going to want to lose its ability to influence what happens on the peninsula and hand that over to Russia. So they've got some problems right now in that regard, for sure. They also are sort of distracted watching what's happening here, frankly, trying to figure out how best to approach what will need to be their management of the relationship with the incoming administration. So a full plate for them. I think we have some.
Could we take maybe two over on that side? And I think my guess is these are our last two questions, just because we're close on time.
Oh, thank you. I'm Richard Downey from the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, and thanks for a very interesting discussion. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Israel's strategy in the Middle East. I mean, it seemed that after having seriously degraded Hamas in Gaza, excuse me, and decapitating Hezbollah in Lebanon, that would have been a great opportunity for them to have declared a ceasefire, get the hostages back, but they haven't done it. And there's talk in Israel about going to the source, Iran. I wonder if you could talk about some of Israel's objectives in this, or what might satisfy them. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming this morning. On China, my understanding is that China is facing a demographic time bomb. How will, if that isn't true, how will that affect what you're crystal balling our relationship will happen?
I will start on the Israel strategy question, and Melanie, we want to speak to that as well as to the China piece. But I think you bring out some really troubling contradictions. Israel has been remarkably successful in terms of actually achieving its war aims in Gaza, and now spectacular success in terms of degrading both the leadership and, in fact, the arsenal that Hezbollah had. Really, which was, such a profound threat to Israelis for so long. Both because I think of the political personality of Benjamin Netanyahu, the fact that he has, relied on the coalition that he has, which is far to the right, and he has in fact lost some of the more centrist figures in his coalition. I think we all have to be worried about this sense of maximalism. I think the maximalism that we saw in terms of the devastation of Gaza was ill-advised. It certainly was. This is one of the most difficult battle spaces in history. So it was not going to be easy to avoid civilian casualties, but I think the damage that has been done to Israel's reputation around the world as a result of the scenes coming out of Gaza, as a result of the difficulty in getting humanitarian aid to Gaza, will be difficult for Israelis for a very long time. And that is something that we know as a country ourselves, because we are still dealing with the legacy of our military engagement in Afghanistan and Iraq. So, I know that the Biden administration has worked very hard. It often isn't seen publicly, in part because what they have often managed to do is to avoid worse outcomes, whether it's in Rafah, whether it's with the original desire on the part of the Israelis to go into Lebanon immediately on October 9th. These are outcomes that are not necessarily broadcast, because in fact it's the quiet influence that has prevented worse things from happening. But I think that, we are an essential partner and ally to the Israelis, but we are also a source of hard-fought, hard-won experience in terms of maximalist objectives and thinking about the long term. I greatly hope that we will not see Israel overplay its hand with respect to Iran. I think there's a lot of almost too much of a sense of we're winning, and that's true here in Washington as well, that the Iranians are super vulnerable. The most recent Israeli attack on Iran was beautifully done, a Goldilocks attack that basically avoided an immediate escalatory spiral, but left the Iranians hugely vulnerable, and they know it. And that, combined with the degradation of Hezbollah, leaves them in a very weak position. But Iranians play the long game. They have been very successful, even at times where they have been set back in a dramatic way strategically, because they're prepared to wait it out. And they are going to move quickly to try to assert their influence in the aftermath. So I hope that Trump will do as I think the Biden people have tried to do, which is to exert some responsible influence on Israeli decision-making.
I'm certainly not going to try to add anything to what Suzanne has just said, but I'll take up the question about China. You mentioned demographics specifically, but there are other internal, domestic, economic issues that China is dealing with now and is going to have to continue dealing with in the future. Demographics are a big part of that. Now, there are two things I would say. The first is, in terms of demographics, there are solutions to that. One of them is migration. Now, that's a difficult approach for China to choose, but it is an available option if it were really, if the leadership level really thought it were necessary. Despite the problems that sort of we see externally looking in at the Chinese economy and its trajectory over the long term, I will tell you that in exchanges with counterparts, and not just mine, but those that I hear from other colleagues who are very well connected through, here and in China, is that they are not worried. They don't have that. They are not as sort of concerned about their internal picture as those of us sitting on the outside sort of think that they ought to be. So that might be because they have a fundamentally different approach to thinking about what macro indicators are important to them. Maybe because they have confidence in their leadership's ability to manage those headwinds and to lead them through what might be some complicated and difficult times. And or it might be because they sort of believe that as a nation and as a society, they're prepared to eat bitterness in service of that's the phrase that they use of enduring hardship, is to eat bitterness for some period of time, to keep their country on the trajectory that they believe it is on, which is to be rejuvenated and become one of the world's great powers again. So we'll have to see if their confidence is well-founded or if our concern is well-founded, and sort of all of the intricacies that are going to come up in the interim. I think we're getting the signal.